Welcome to another episode of Rose Resource Room. Today I'm here with Irene, and I'm super excited because we're going to talk about reading. We may start to geek out about reading, but we're going to try to keep it practical so that you can get the tools that you need. Irene, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
It is absolutely my pleasure. So before I start asking you 2 million questions, because I'm sure the minute you say one thing, I'm going to have 5 questions. But before we get into that, just tell us a little bit about yourself. I have one rule though. You
Okay.
cannot start with your titles. So I know you have your PhD, I know you have a son, so your mom and all that, but you can't start with your roles or your titles. You have to tell me about you, and then you can tell me all the hats that you wear and roles that you play.
Oh, about me. Oh my
I know
gosh.
our identity is so into our kids and our family and like all the things. So yes, tell us about the woman.
The woman. So that is the question resonates with me because the woman is a woman who lives in New York City and also on Long Island and is much too busy and is currently in Ann Arbor, taking a much needed break to think about who am I? And I have been
Mm,
spending the past couple of weeks reading things like find your why, what's your why, what's your purpose. So I am a person who loves helping people. I love being outdoors. Um, I love my family. Um, and I am very happy to be at this point in my life. I'll tell you more about that later with the hats. But you're absolutely right. We all define ourselves maybe too much by our roles. And I'm going to think about this more after we finish.
yeah.
Um,
I love that you're taking time for that. It's so important because a lot of times our identity is so wrapped up in the what we do, right? The mom, the wife, the ex-career person, new whatever. So I really think it's amazing that you're setting intentional time to reflect on that. A lot more of us need to do that, including me. So now you get to tell us all about your titles and your roles.
okay. That was a
That's more
great
familiar.
start. Well, I love this. That was a great start. No, and it actually puts my titles in perspective. It's like
Okay,
this is what I do, and this is not who I am.
that's right.
So yes. Um, so I was about to say I am a developmental psychologist, but what I do for a living,
Ooh, I
I
like the
work
pivot.
as a developmental psychologist. I am an author and a wife and a mother of two adult sons. I have to tell you, it's new for today. When I was thinking, how am I going to introduce myself? I've been watching podcasts by a woman whose name I can't remember, but she's a professor at Duke. She introduced herself as a professor at Duke, an author, and a podcaster. And today, and I usually say I'm a developmental psychologist and an author. And then having spent the past week or so reflecting, for today, for our talk, I actually added wife and mother of two adult sons. I used to not even put that in my description, my role description, but I really have consciously come to appreciate how important it is to be a person as well. But as a developmental psychologist, and the reason I'm here to help, hopefully, as a developmental psychologist, I specialize in helping children reach their full academic potential. And part of that, I think the fundamental bedrock of being able to reach your full academic potential is knowing how to read and knowing how to read well. And a lot of kids, we'll talk about this more later, but just as a brief introduction, a lot of kids who attend school have been mistaught reading. They were turned into struggling readers. One of them was my son, which is actually how I became a developmental psychologist. I was a journalist in my first career and went back to school to get my PhD in what I thought would be clinical psychology, working with women who were experiencing infertility. And while I was in school, my son came home and said, Mommy, my school isn't teaching me how to read. Um, they tell us to look at the pictures and guess what the words are, and that's not reading, Mommy. How do you read? And I told him to trust his school. And that was just quite the disaster. So much so a disaster that I pivoted in my career. I did a lot of research. I dived into what was going wrong in schools. And I thought, wow, this is really terrible. And I want to do something about this. I want to help these children. And I switched my track. I was at a school that luckily, it's probably one of the few schools in the country that would allow you to do this, to switch from clinical to developmental psych. And I studied reading and I learned all about how children, should be taught how to read. And the experience of what I went through with my son was so traumatic that I wrote this book. I didn't believe him, which is a memoir about what we went through and how I really saved his academic life without tooting my horn. It's really like our struggles, literally how, like, you're in the trenches with us as I'm like dying because I have no idea what I'm doing, trying to figure out how to teach this poor little boy who's having nightmares about school how to read. So it's not a toot your horn kind of a book. It's you live through the experience with us, and it tells all about the history of reading instruction and what parents need to know. And I'm sorry, this is a little long. And I also wrote a series of books that parents can use to teach their kids how to read at home, because my mission in life, I feel, professionally and really personally, because this is personal too. I lived through this. I saw my son struggle every day in my work. I see children struggling, is to help parents know everything they need to know about teaching reading, and for them to know if you do it right from the beginning, it is so easy to do. It is so much fun to do. It isn't this like major thing that you need a degree or you need a curriculum with 500 different pieces. It's like very, very easy and fun. So that's me as a professional.
Thank you so, so much for sharing that. And before we dive into the how, like what is the correct way or like how to teach a child accurately and efficiently how to read, can you tell me a little bit about the different reasons children struggle? Like why are they having difficulties reading?
Well, the main reason is until very recently, many, many, many schools for literally 100 years have not been teaching systematic phonics, which means, phonics where you teach every rule. You teach from the beginning, you teach short vowels, then you teach something called blends, which are words like stop and clap, and then you teach CH and SH words, and then silent E, which is like long vowels, and you give children only stories that have words that you have taught them, so they don't feel overwhelmed or, oh, I can't read this book, I don't know what these words are. Um, for and some schools have done a great job. It's a big country, and this does not apply to every school. And I think it's important for homeschooling parents to know about, because it affects the kinds of books and materials that they will be able to find still now to use, work with their children, especially little decodable stories that kids can sound out. Those are very hard to come by. They're really hard. If you walk into Barnes and Noble or, whatever, it's not easy. And the reason is, in the, I don't know how much how much in depth to go into this. I'm not sure. Do you want the history, the story of how, or just a short answer? They have not been taught phonics in school until recently. There's something called the science of reading now that is infiltrating classrooms. And I know parents, when I spoke at the CHAP convention, parents were aware of the science of reading, which are actually findings that were Congress convened a panel in the year 2000 because reading was such a disaster in our country. I am going to give a short summary, because without the summary, I think it doesn't make sense for people. So before the 1920s, kids learned to read using phonics. When we were established as a country, kids learned to read at home. Their parents taught them, their grandparents taught them. They were taught to sound out words. When they went to school, schools were pretty much a dreadful place where they sat on wooden benches and they had dunce caps and they were punished and, smacked. And it was all like, drills to learn things. And there was a man, his name was Horace Mann. He's the father of public education in our country, who went to one of those schools. He was lucky enough to be able to afford it. You had to pay for school back then. Um, and he hated it. And he cared about children so much that he, for his honeymoon, went and visited schools. He was the Secretary of Education in Massachusetts. And for his honeymoon, he went to Europe to see how they did it in Europe. And in Germany, he was exposed to a method of teaching where kids memorized whole words. They didn't sound them out. And this just seemed like a lot more fun. And it seemed like they learned quickly. And he came back and really advocated for that in the late 1800s. This was not the 1920s. It was put into some schools. The principals of Boston schools were so appalled and they wrote scathing letters and they won. So it went nowhere in the 1800s. But Horace Mann also established the first teachers' college. So from the time schools that trained teachers existed, this method of teaching that poo-pooed or downplayed step-by-step systematic phonics was being taught in the colleges or places that train teachers. In the 1920s, I'll try to sum this up. In the 1920s, this method entered the classroom during the progressive era. It was a time where there was a lot of change and a lot of change happened in education. A method called look-say was put into use. The Dick and Jane books are part of that curriculum. The Dick and Jane books, I think, are fantastic if used properly, right? There's a place for them. And on my website, actually, I have a list of decodable stories and stories kids can read at certain stages. And Dick and Jane have a place right there after they've learned the silent E rule. But back then, kids learned only the words in the Dick and Jane books. They were not told the alphabet existed. They were expected to memorize words, and those words were not really useful, right? Like see, spot, go. Anyway, look-say was taught from the 1920s to the 1950s. In the 1950s, a book called Why Johnny Can't Read came out. So this has like been going on for so long. It was a huge, eye-opener. It was the first time someone said our kids are struggling with reading, and schools were parents were demanding phonics, and finally it seemed like phonics would come back into classrooms. It didn't, because another way of teaching called whole language came to be. Whole language believed kids learn to read as naturally as we learned to speak. Also a disaster, to sum up. California implemented whole language. It had been at the top of the rankings in reading scores. They put in whole language. They moved to the bottom, second only to Guam. Became a national emergency. Congress convened the National Reading Panel. It's a panel of experts that went over 100,000 studies looking at how kids should be taught. They identified the 5 pillars of effective reading instruction. And again, it was thought that phonics would be put into the classroom. It was in a greater way than it had been, but it was very hodgepodgey. It was something called balanced literacy. They still believed kids learn to read by being read to. They figure it out on their own. And they taught phonics through writing. So it's something called invented spelling. They would spell of as UV, and that would be accepted as okay, because that's how it was spelled. It's just unbelievable how many people's lives were ruined because of this. Like people, they've done statistics that inmates in prison, I don't know the number offhand, but it's the vast majority of them are illiterate. And, they're in there because they didn't learn how to read, which set them on just a terrible course in life. This is changing now in schools thanks to the pandemic. A lot of parents saw what was happening or not happening in the classroom because of remote learning. It's gotten a lot of really great press coverage, and this way of teaching is now actually illegal in some states in our country. But that is the sad story of what happened to children who we're not homeschooled. So that was a very long answer to your question.
No, that's completely fine. I was actually going to ask you to share a little bit about the history. So that was really good because I do know like what you were talking about with the progressive error. I am so fascinated with like teaching children to read and I'm probably equally frustrated. I remember, so I have three boys, but a 10-year-old, an 8-year-old, and a 2-year-old.
I
And I
remember your
remember,
2-year-old running
yeah,
you.
I know. I remember when I first found out that I was pregnant, I said, "Oh, I should teach another kid to read." Like that was one of the first thoughts that came to mind. Not, just expanding my family, but literally having to teach another child how to read
When you were pregnant with your
when I was
third,
pregnant with my third.
did you
Yeah.
find it difficult to do? You found it hard?
So I didn't have full control. So it's not like I was the first teacher. My oldest went to public school until first grade during the pandemic. We pulled him out. My middle guy went to daycare and then something that they tried to do during the pandemic. I don't know what that was, but that didn't work too well. Then we pulled both of them out, put them in private school before homeschooling. So they've kind of dabbled in it before. The youngest will be the only one who I will actually fully teach to read. But I say all that to say that there were so many gaps that I was kind of like filling gaps before being able to like fully move them forward. And I did find it a little bit challenging with the middle one for a couple reasons. One, sometimes I conflated lack of ability with lack of desire. So my first one inhales books, right? So he's like, "Oh, can I read this? Can I read this?" And he'll just spend so much time reading. The middle one did not do that. So I was like, wait, can he not read? It's not that he couldn't, it's that he didn't want to. Two very different things, but I was kind of like practicing on him, right? Um, and then I just started reading so much, and I saw a prestigious university, you probably know who I'm talking about, in New York City decided that their teachers college was going to pull phonics out of the curriculum. And I'm like, well, how are you going to teach these kids? And it was literally what you just said. Context clues, not in the good way, but here's a picture of a fox, here's a picture of a bear. Which one starts with B? Then it must be bear. And I'm like, I'm just going to call them out. Columbia University, you're
Right,
doing
right,
this?
right.
I was so surprised when I saw that. But I understand what you're saying with the science of reading. And the last two pillars are the vocabulary and the comprehension. But those first three, when I was teaching, I was like, when does this end? We did the short vowels, we did this, we did the digraphs, the diphthongs. When does it end? Like, what is your response to when do you say that a child can read? Because you have a 2-year-old who says, the cat in the hat, and you're like, yeah, my 2-year-old can read. Well, not if they can't pull out Art of War or War and Peace, right? So
Right, right.
when do you actually say that a child can read?
Um, I say a child can read from the very beginning when they begin decoding. Clearly, that's not reading, that's not War and Peace, but it is reading. It is reading for their stage and their, point in life. So I actually, at the end of my workbooks, each one, including the short vowel one, I have a little diploma and it says, I can read. And they quiver with joy when they get to that point. They're so excited, to get to each step. And it's funny, there was a little boy who I'm working with, and I'm away, and I gave his tutor book 3 and book 4 in the series. Book 3 is digraphs, and book 4 is silent E. And he saw both of the books and he said, "Oh, I can't wait to get to silent E." And I'm thinking, wow. And I said, really? You're so excited about making progress through these rules. And he said, no, the puppy on the cover is so cute. And we just have to remember these are such little precious darling beings, and reading means different things at different stages as children progress through school. And we should really celebrate each step of that and make them feel like they are readers, because for where they are and what they know, they are reading well. When someone becomes an official reader in terms of being able to move forward, and it's really when they switch from learning to read to reading to learn. When they can read fluently, they can comprehend what they're reading, they're comfortable. That's when they are really reading, the way we adults would say, how we read. Well, I can't hear you for some reason.
Based on that response, I'll actually edit my response. So you asked me if I found reading difficult. And to be honest, the process was not difficult. Working with my child was actually a joy, but the expectation was off, right? Because I'm a very impatient person. So if I put in 20 minutes of work, I want to see 2 million hours of progress, right? So based on what you're sharing, my expectation was off. You think, okay, I've been doing this for a week. Okay, now pull out this big book. No, it doesn't work like that. The incremental piece and the steps is kind of like that faith journey, right? Like you can't see every single step, but you know that you're making progress and you know that God is in the whole thing. So just trust. That was my flaw and my fault. So reading itself, not hard to teach. The expectation and the mindset, that's where I showed.
And what you just said, and I'm not sure if you meant it the way you said it, but you taught him something and then you pull out the big book and expect him to be able to read it.
Correct.
That's a disconnect that is still happening in schools. And I'm seeing, now that my practice is in Manhattan in New York, and Manhattan has switched to doing phonics now, and kids know their phonics rules. They come to me and they can recite them, but they still can't read. And I am getting, my business boomed, much to my honestly chagrin a little bit, because the goal was like, let this all be okay for everybody, and I'm going to tutor something else. Like let this have a happy ending.
Yeah.
But kids used to come because they couldn't read, literally could not read. Now parents are bringing them because they hate reading. There's a resistance, like you saw with your middle
Yeah.
child.
Yeah.
And the reason there's a resistance is the schools, even though they are teaching phonics, there is this lack of decodable stories. Decodable means able to be sounded out for each of the levels, so that there are the Bob books for the beginning readers,
Right.
and there are a few others, but you need more, and people are aware of this and they're writing them and publishing them. They're not all really great. So finding good ones is tricky. But what the schools are doing is they're sending home the stories they used to send home when kids were guessing from the picture. And those books have big words in them like dinosaur and astronaut, where kids have to guess from the picture, and inevitably they guess wrong. I remember there was the first time I realized my son was struggling with reading, because he memorized all the stories and he seemed to be reading fine. What was when he brought home a book called After School, and it was after school I have a snack, the word, but the picture showed a girl holding a plate and a sandwich, no, a plate in her lap with a sandwich on it and holding a glass of milk. And he should have read, after school I have a snack, but he read, after school I have a glass of milk, because that's what the picture said. After school I have a sandwich, because that's what was in it, right? And he didn't know how to sound out snack because he hadn't been taught how to sound out words. So once kids need to resort to guessing from context or the picture, they will guess wrong. You're going to say no. They're going to feel bad. And anytime we all of us, all humans, little ones and big ones, when it's hard, we start losing our motivation,
Yeah.
right? This is not fun. No, I'm guessing wrong. I can't do this.
Mm.
I can't. So I'm having these children come to me who can read. That's why I'm saying who can read is defined so differently as they progress. But I have kids coming to me who can read. They can read short, books with short vowels in them and the early sight words, but they certainly can't read a book that with the word astronaut in it, and they think they can't read. So
Yeah, let's stay there a little bit, Irene. So give us some practical tools, right? So my 2-year-old is starting to read. This is theoretically. My 2-year-old is starting to read. He looks at the picture. He says dog, and I'm like, no, no, no. What is a better way to say that where it doesn't kill their motivation? Or what is a better response?
he should not be using the picture to guess what the word is ever. Um, in pre-reading, as a 2-year-old, he can be looking at the pictures and like making up a story, sure. But once he's actually reading and sounding out words, you want to say to him, don't guess what the word is from the picture. Look at the letters, look at the word. And if he says, sometimes what happens is, kids will learn short A words, and then you start teaching them short I words, and they think every word has short A in it because that's what they have learned well. So if he's reading, you want him to read the word kit, but he says cat, don't say no. Use it as a teaching moment. Say, that would be cat if there was an A. Forget about the C. We're just talking about the vowels because there's something called nonsense words, which actually are used in reading assessments. They're not real words, but are they sounded out phonetically correctly? So like just say that would be sounded out as cat if there was an A, good job, but there's an I. What is that word, knowing that it's an I? So try not to use the word no. Try to turn that moment into a encouraging moment and a teaching moment.
I knew you'd have a tip for us, and you don't even have questions. You have no idea what I'm going to ask you, but you're just ready. So another question just popped up in my head. Um, this is probably a loaded question. How important is curriculum? So you go to the store or you're online and you're like, I just need to find the perfect curriculum and then I'm going to be able to teach my kid how to read. How important is curriculum versus method versus approach versus philosophy or just in general? Is curriculum the missing piece?
Um, Curriculum is important because it guides people, including teachers, for what they should teach, because often teachers will walk into a classroom and honestly have no idea how to teach. I spent last year in a classroom in Manhattan helping a teacher, training her in reading, and she was just lost. and such a well-intentioned teacher with a master's from Columbia, from Teachers College, and just she didn't know how to reach, the children. And there's curriculum and there's curriculum. The curriculum that school was using, because, I'm familiar with schools and what schools do. I'm less familiar with the specifics of homeschooling curriculums. Um, I can tell you that as someone who tutors children, I've looked at various curriculums, I've looked at various workbooks. I've yet to find one that I follow even, I will pull from here and here and here and put it together. That's actually why I wrote those workbooks, not to sell my workbooks. It's why I wrote them because, I put together how I taught Eric, which is how science says you should teach, or like, anyone would say you teach short vowels, you teach blends, you teach that, but you also teach with games and with joy and with, you need to read these stories now. I found nothing that gave me that. And I, so yes, curriculum is important. It gives you something to hang your hat on, but if it's not feeling right to you, don't feel you have to stick with it because this is what the curriculum says. Curriculums are written by human beings, just like you and me, and they're not always perfect.
I think that's a fair answer. Because I know for reading, like with any subject, honestly, you may go in and you're like, yeah, this is not working. I just need to find the right thing. And sometimes it's like I told you earlier, it was a character thing for me. I needed to exhibit more patience. I needed to be more consistent, right? You can't put in 20 minutes of work and expect results of, 200 hours of work. So I think that's a very balanced answer. So I know you wrote the book, and Eric was the one who the school didn't believe him, right?
Mhm. I
Tell us
didn't
a little.
believe him. I
I'm,
didn't
I'm
believe
sorry
him.
that you didn't believe him, and you were telling them to trust the school. Tell me a little bit more about your other child and like his learning experience.
Two
Well,
very
not
different,
child, your adult.
my adult child, two very different students, two very different uh, approaches to learning. One, I am a big believer. I'm not familiar with the Myers-Briggs system in its totality, and I haven't studied it, but I have done a lot of reading into it because a lot of what Myers-Briggs says about sensing and intuiting, I don't know if you're familiar with that, but like, sensors when it comes to reading, they need phonics. They go step by step, and they're very logical, systematic learners. It maps onto research that has been done in reading in areas like where our children holistic or analytical learners, meaning big picture, big idea people who are willing to skip paragraphs, skip words if they don't know them. They'll get the big picture idea versus the little picture guys who need to read every word or they stop. Eric was like that. Those kids, those sensing analytical learners, I actually did my dissertation on this. It's called field dependent or independent. It all maps onto science. Myers-Briggs, by the way, isn't considered scientifically validated because it's based on self-report. And self-report is not believed to be, you can't always trust it. But my older son was, when I did my dissertation, I was looking at how come it works for some kids? Why do some kids learn okay this way? And I've tutored kids who came to me for phonics, and it seemed like they breathe and they learn to read. Like, the parents were saying thank you, and I'm saying I didn't do it. He learned like this. Usually those are the global learners who are big picture, who often will not read the directions, who will move on, who can't tell you how they got their answer, can't explain it, but they know they got it. That's my older son, Jameson. And Eric is, I need to know how to do this. I can tell you how I got it, and this is how you can do it. He's amazing at math. It's a very mathematical, logical, science-oriented mind. So two very, very different learners, very different experiences.
And I think that's a perfect plug for homeschooling because when I first started homeschooling, I only had the two boys at the time, and they're 2 years apart. And I remember teaching them and exactly what you're saying. We're just unique beings, right? We have different learning styles, we have different love languages, all the things. And I remember teaching them, and I was like, how does a public school effectively teach 15 to 30 children at once when I'm here with two unique individuals who need different approaches? So I'm really happy that I get, the IEP. They use the individual education plan for neurodivergent learners, but my children are neurotypical, but it's still an IEP because I get to teach them based on the way they learn. So I think that's a great plug for Quiet Homeschool if anyone is on the fence.
I agree.
Anything else you want to share with us?
I think it's such a gift when parents are homeschooling their children. Both of my kids went to school, and I had to support them so much, even though they were in school, and it caused such stress at times because I had to learn what they were doing. So I think I met you at the CHAP conference, and I met so many wonderful people there, and I just think my hat goes off to people who thought about doing it. I never thought about doing it. Just didn't, like, kids go to school. So I think it's wonderful when parents are consciously educating their children and thinking about the best way to teach. And I agree. I mean, one-on-one is amazing, the difference between that and a group.
Well, I also think that times have changed because when I first had children, at no point did homeschooling ever cross my mind. I honestly don't think I knew about homeschooling until maybe the year or two before the pandemic. So my husband and I, we just always thought we would, rent and then we would purchase a home and pay a bunch of taxes and get a really, really good school. But I do think times have changed where the quality is not the same. And what happens in public school is more of socialization and potentially indoctrination versus academic education. So I was like you in terms of, all right, we'll just put them in school. And then fast forward, my husband said to me, Ro, we have to pull the kids out. We're living in a small town and we had no issues. We had a really good experience with my son up to first grade in public school. Nothing negative happened, but just the environment and the cultural shifts, he said to me, bro, we can't have the kids in public school. And that's when we pulled them out, put them in private school. And then I felt called because it definitely wasn't something that I thought about. In fact, when my husband said, let's homeschool, his idea was we'll have a teacher come to the house or a tutor come to the house and teach them. We would continue to work in New York City. And that was our idea or version until I felt that I was supposed to do it. So I completely understand why it never crossed your mind. But you have been a wealth of information and such a blessing and a gift to the homeschool community and beyond. So I just really want to thank you for your time, for your
Thank you.
treasure. And I see this like kind of as a ministry. It's like you went through this in your life. No other parent will go through this on my watch. I'm going to help. So I really appreciate it
Thank you. Thank you.
so much for being here.